Camilla didn't whisper, didn't glance around. She looked straight at the girl, the future Queen of England, and said, "Sit down, princess." Not as advice, as command, as dismissal. Charlotte didn't argue, didn't cry. She just froze. Hands folded, lips pressed, eyes lowered. And that's when the royal guard moved. No theatrics, no warning, just one sharp step forward. "Mom, you will address Her Royal Highness appropriately." Camilla blinked. "I outrank the girl." And the guard replied, "Not in this room." Now, before we show you the exact moment her authority collapsed, and the 37 seconds that changed everything, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Tap like, hit subscribe, and make sure that bell icon's turned on, because what happened in that hall didn't leave a mark. It left a message. The hush inside the St. George's audience hall was not the kind born of reverence. It was the soft velvet thick quiet of a gathering that understood its own weight. This was no coronation, no funeral, no tour, just a seated reception. Private, polished, perfectly rehearsed for senior Commonwealth donors, veteran staff of the Crown's charitable network, and a short list of ceremonial observers. Notably absent were cameras. This was a room that knew how to archive its own memory without needing film. The lighting was soft gold, drawn low from hanging fixtures above the high windows. The air smelled faintly of waxed wood and old velvet. Conversations were restrained, pleasant, practiced. Every breath carried polish. Princess Charlotte sat quietly near the forward tier of seats, angled just shy of the central conversation circle. She wore a deep sapphire coat dress with matching flats, her posture upright but not stiff, hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a kind of settled confidence in her presence, not forced, not mimicked, simply inherited, like the quality of her tailoring. Behind her stood a cold stream guard, scarlet tunic, white belt, tall bearskin hat, and a stillness that did not blink. His name was Sergeant Callum Granger, 37, former infantry turned palace detail. He had stood watch over rooms full of trembling tension from state funerals to contested inheritance councils, but none of them felt quite like this. He'd been briefed that this event was routine, a recognition seating for long-term partners of the Royal Legacy Preservation Fund, a handful of senior royals, brief formalities, light refreshments. But something in the way the chairs had been arranged, the way the staff kept glancing sideways at the doors, the way Queen Camilla stood too close to the stewards organizing the guest introductions, something felt tighter than it should have been. Camilla was at the center of the hosting rotation today, standing near the senior protocol aide with her hands lightly clasped in front of her clutch. Her smile had barely moved in the last 10 minutes. She directed the seating arrangements herself, a small formality that once might have belonged to the late Queen, but now passed to whoever asserted the most presence. It should have been simple until Charlotte leaned forward slightly, not dramatically, not improperly, just enough to smile at a guest being seated near her, a woman from Canada who had once worked closely with the Queen's Environmental Trust. The gesture was polite, a dignified nod, nothing disruptive. Camilla turned, and the voice came out like a needle dipped in glass. "Sit down, princess. You're not presiding this room." It wasn't shouted, but it wasn't quiet either. Clear, cold, public. Charlotte froze. The woman beside her looked momentarily unsure whether to respond or not. A few heads turned. The staff at the rear of the chamber didn't move, but they stopped thinking about moving. The sound didn't echo, but the meaning did. Sergeant Granger's jaw didn't tighten. His gaze didn't shift, his shoulders didn't square, but his mind had already moved, because that sentence and no, 6 words uninvited and unmistakably intended to cut didn't belong to family protocol. It belonged to breach. And that's when the clock started ticking. 37 seconds. Not to embarrassment, not to punishment, to correction, to the exact moment where the guard would destroy everything. Camilla thought she still controlled. Charlotte didn't move at first, not even a blink. She kept her eyes level, gaze pointed slightly downward, still angled in the direction of the guest beside her. But the rest of her body, spine, shoulders, chin, locked into a composed stillness that only someone very young and very trained could manage. She didn't correct her posture. She didn't reply. She didn't look toward Camilla. She just froze, not in fear, but in containment. Sergeant Granger remained motionless at his post behind her, though internally his observational focus had narrowed. That sentence from Camilla hadn't been idle reprimand. It hadn't been the casual discipline of a grandmother. It had been calculated social assertion delivered to humiliate, not instruct. The guests hadn't expected it either. Across the front row, the Canadian dignitary shifted slightly in her seat. An older gentleman beside her cleared his throat with the kind of dryness that meant, "We pretend we didn't hear that." A diplomatic attaché standing near the rear screens glanced toward the steward and subtly stepped back, giving the space between the royals a wider berth. Catherine, seated near the edge of the chamber across from Charlotte, raised her head. She had caught the moment in full. She didn't rise, she didn't speak, but her expression changed. The faintest narrowing of the eyes, a stillness in the way her fingers folded, the kind of stillness that in private would precede a quiet but final conversation. William was not in the room. His absence was deliberate, a calculated scheduling gap designed to avoid crowding the event with too many active royals. This was Camilla's event to host. Charlotte's presence had been symbolic, but now that symbolism had become a target, and in the precise 10 seconds that followed Camilla's command, the mood of the room changed completely. The guests didn't speak, but they felt it. Charlotte, after a long pause, straightened her back just slightly and adjusted the hem of her coat dress. It was a small movement, but it sent a clear message. She was still seated, still listening, but not shamed. Camilla, on the other hand, had already turned her attention back toward the reception steward, as if the incident had never happened. Her expression was neutral, unreadable, hands clasped behind her back in perfect ceremonial posture. But Granger had seen the flicker, not in her face, in her eyes. The quick sideways glance, before she turned the moment she registered Charlotte's stillness and resented it. It wasn't disobedience that unsettled her. It was lack of compliance. Granger didn't shift posture, not yet, but he took a slightly deeper breath through his nose. The kind trained men take when they're recalibrating proximity, tension and command hierarchy in a room that's about to go sideways. There was a protocol for these moments, not an official one, an internal one. When minor royals are undermined in front of institutional partners, there are tolerances, soft thresholds, things guards observe silently, log mentally, and only act on when thresholds are breached 3 times. This had been 1, 2 more, and Sergeant Granger would no longer be a ceremonial observer. He would become the room's spine, and Camilla would find out exactly what it meant to issue an order the Crown didn't authorize. Sergeant Granger had never drawn his sidearm in service of the Crown. Not once, not even when protesters shattered protocol barriers, or when an unruly diplomat once reached too close to the late Queen. Because with men like him, men handpicked not just for posture, but for perception, defense didn't begin with reaction. It began with stillness. And as he stood behind Princess Charlotte, eyes forward, ears absorbing every movement of air, footstep, breath shift and tone, he didn't move a muscle, but he'd started counting. Not seconds in the theatrical sense, not for drama, for pattern. The Royal Household Security Guide didn't mention humiliation protocol, and it didn't need to, because the worst kinds of threats weren't always found in noise or trespass. Sometimes they arrived dressed in pearls, speaking calmly, and carrying inherited power they no longer possessed, but refused to relinquish. Camilla continued her slow orbit of the front row, pausing once to speak to a well-known arts patron from Australia, nodding faintly at an environmental chairwoman from New Zealand. Her tone was warm, measured, familiar, but not once did she glance back toward Charlotte. Not once did she offer correction or courtesy, and not once did she break from the illusion that her words, "Sit down, princess," had been anything but appropriate. Charlotte hadn't moved since her subtle self-correction. She remained upright, poised, her hands still folded, as if she were not the youngest royal present, but the most aware of how to act in the presence of something improper. Granger watched her shoulders carefully. They were steady, no slouch, no shake. But every few seconds her fingers adjusted, not nervously, not childishly, just checked. A quiet ritual of someone reminding themselves that control could still be maintained even if it wasn't given. Granger respected it, and he logged it. 15 seconds passed. Camilla approached the perimeter again, this time brushing past one of the junior stewards, who was adjusting the reception cards on the side buffet. She gave a tight nod, then turned slightly, and once again came within range of Charlotte's position. Granger's right hand remained at his side, but his fingers flexed once subtly. No one would see it. No one should see it. But the internal clock was ticking. Camilla stopped briefly to address a guest behind Charlotte's row, a long retired military attaché from the Caribbean. Her voice carried slightly. "And you remember, I trust," she said, "how difficult these modern balancing acts have become. So many roles floating about now, such confusion of place." The words weren't directed at Charlotte, but they were meant for her. Granger didn't breathe differently, didn't blink more, but in the corner of his awareness, a line was being drawn, not yet acted upon, but prepared. The second incident didn't need to be verbal. It was the shape of power Camilla was projecting. It was the kind of posture that assumed permission. Granger had seen it before from a distance in foreign embassies, when leaders felt legacy slipping beneath their feet and tried to compensate through misused proximity. This wasn't rebellion, it was an infection of arrogance. And if it approached again too close, too direct, there would be no warning, only procedure. Camilla's approach was slow enough to pass as coincidence, but not to someone trained to read rooms the way others read faces. Sergeant Granger felt the shift before he saw it, the slight change in air pressure, the soft scrape of heels that stopped one pace too close to where Charlotte sat. He did not turn his head, he didn't need to. His peripheral vision registered the angle of Camilla's posture as she leaned just enough for proximity to become message. Charlotte remained still, her eyes lowered politely, posture proper, but she knew Camilla was near. She could feel it in the way the air behind her warned. Camilla did not speak immediately. She let the moment hover. It was no longer correction. It was theater. Granger tightened internal focus. Camilla's voice came out soft this time, lowered, almost conversational, not for the whole room, only for the girl seated beneath her shadow. "You are a guest in your own future. Remember that," she said, the words carefully measured, the syllables edged with controlled disapproval. Charlotte did not look up, but she did inhale just once. Then she answered, not in defiance, not in panic, but with the quiet clarity of someone who understood the rulebook better than she was being treated. "I am only following what my family has taught me," she said, voice level and unshaken, "and how Grandma asked me to behave." The name was not dramatic, but the meaning was. Camilla's lips pressed thin. For the first time since the reception began, irritation surfaced through her composed veneer. Her breath escaped sharply through her nose, a restrained exhale that sounded almost like a scoff disguised as composure. Granger saw it now, the unmistakable presence of emotional imbalance. This wasn't leadership, this wasn't guidance, this was frustration closing in on volatility. Camilla's eyes flicked across the room briefly, as if measuring whether the dignity in Charlotte's response had been witnessed. Then they returned, closer now, sharper, and for a half breath, the silence widened. The nearer she leaned, the more the posture ceased to resemble protocol. She was no longer correcting, she was encroaching. It happened subtly enough that most guests continued their shallow murmurs, their quiet exchanges, their practiced smiles. To them it still resembled a tense conversation, something slightly awkward perhaps, but Granger did not operate on appearances. He was tracking positioning down to inches, and Camilla had crossed from informal to inappropriate. The breach wasn't only physical, it was emotional.
You speak as though that name protects you, Camilla murmured again, the faintest chill entering her voice. As though legacy alone entitles you to presence. Charlotte shifted her hands slightly, folding them again. Tighter now. Presence is not something I asked for, she replied, but I do respect where I've been placed. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Camilla's pupils narrowed, the kind of reaction that preceded clipped judgment or thinly veiled reprimand. She straightened just slightly, but the tension didn't release. Sergeant Callum Granger had been watching when the atmosphere changed. Camilla's tone cooled. Remember where you are, princess. This is not your stage. Charlotte didn't argue. She lowered her chin in silence. Behind her, Granger shifted his weight a fraction, ready. One more sentence, and this stopped being a social slight and became something he could no longer ignore. Camilla turned back, voice precise. Sit down, princess. She flicked her hand downward, a dismissive gesture meant for staff, not a future queen. Charlotte froze, fingers tightening on her dress. That was enough. Granger stepped once, clean and sharp, placing himself between them. The room fell silent. Ma'am, he said, voice calm and clear, you will address Her Royal Highness appropriately. Camilla blinked. I outrank the girl. Not in this room, Granger replied. This is my event. Camilla insisted. I'm acting within my. Granger cut in, still respectful, still firm. Minor protection protocol forbids directive gestures towards succession-protected figures without parental sanction. Her certainty faltered. She glanced toward the doors, waiting for rescue that didn't come. Instead, they opened. Prince William entered, taking in the tableau in seconds. Charlotte standing steady, Camilla rigid, Granger between them.
What's happening? He asked.
Granger answered evenly. Command phrasing and corrective gestures were directed at Her Royal Highness in a disciplinary manner outside parental authority. Charlotte spoke softly. I stood to greet the Canadian guest. She was speaking to me. I only smiled. William faced Camilla. You do not speak to my daughter like staff, he said. The guard didn't rewrite protocol, he enforced it. Camilla had no answer. Charlotte remained standing because she chose to. Was the guard right to step in publicly? Tell us in the comments, and if you believe respect is earned, not inherited, tap like and subscribe for more Royal Guard stories.